And I would like to ask Renelda to come up, McGilvery, Nova Scotia Federation of Labour, Unifor General Vice President, Treasurer of the Strait Area District Labour Council, and Local 105 Unifor.
Thank you. It's my honor to introduce our guest speaker, Rob Thompson. Rob grew up in Plymouth, just across from the site of the former Westray. In 1983, Rob attended St. X. He studied geology and chemistry and graduated in 1987. On April 15th of 1992, just a few weeks prior to the explosion at Westray, and at the young age of 26, Rob began work at Westray as a junior lab technologist for SGS. After the explosion, Rob lived in Halifax and recently has returned back to Antigonish with his wife Cindy, where they now live. Rob?
Good evening, everyone. I'd like to thank the organizers for inviting me to speak tonight about a topic that is important to all of us. For those who don't know me, my name is Robert Thompson. In these parts, I suppose the next question would be, what's your father's name? So I guess I would say I'm Robert, son of John William, better known by everyone as Jack. I grew up in Pictou County on the outskirts of Stellarton in a community called Plymouth. I suppose I should get to the reason why I'm here tonight. 22 years ago, for a short time, I worked at the Westray coal mine. Most everyone will know the story about Westray and the tragic senseless loss of life. My job, unlike many at the mine, wasn't dangerous. I didn't have to worry about whether I was going to come home every day from work. Instead, I worked behind the scenes as a coal lab technician. My job was to test coal quality to make sure the coal was meeting grades set out in the contract with Nova Scotia Power. Then, like now, jobs were scarce, and I was hired mid-April 1992. I felt I had achieved what every Nova Scotian wants, and that would be getting a steady job. I had, by the time of the explosion, been working there at the mine for 3 weeks, and by then I'd, by and large, settled into the routine of work. I wouldn't realize it until May 9th, but my life intersected with the tragedy of Westray on May 6th. This was the last day I worked prior to the explosion. My day started out much like all the others, conducting the usual tests. At around 10 o'clock in the morning, 4 coal dust samples were received in the lab for testing. Being the first time that I did this type of test, I asked my supervisor how he wanted the samples processed. After explaining the procedure, I went about doing the tests. Once done, I phoned in the results to main office and got back to my regular duties, not aware of the implications of the results and what would then transpire later that day. It wasn't long after that several people from Westray management showed up in our office to discuss the results. Rather than accepting the numbers and doing something to fix the problem, they argued that the test was done incorrectly. I should have known right then and there was a big problem. After further discussion and a trip to the lab where I did the tests and physically walking the Westray officials through the procedure they proceeded to leave the lab. A part of me hoping I convinced them that I was right. Even then, I had a bad feeling, but like most things when it came to safety at Westray, denial of the problem overrode common sense. It is hard to explain what it was like to work at Westray for those who didn't work there. My first day of work made it very clear by abusive managers that production would override any concerns about safety. As I approached the end of my shift on the 6th, in the back of my mind I wondered if the right thing was going to be done to fix the problem with a part of me just wanting to go home and forget about everything that happened that day. Shortly before the end of my shift, I knew two miners I knew from my youth and community showed up in the lab to chat. Robbie Doyle and Larry Bell were like me, young men eager to work in our hometown and not ask many questions. We talked about many things, but not about work. I couldn't realize it at the time, but 3 days later, on the morning of the 9th, Robbie and Larry, along with 24 other men, would be dead. I wish I had told them that day, however. Talk of problems at Westray never went far. It didn't seem like there was anyone to turn to at the time for help anyway, and much like a battered spouse, we were left to our fates. It is sad that in 1992 this was still happening in Canada. As bad as it was before the explosion, what happened after was in many ways, for myself and for everyone else involved, worse. I waited like everyone else for the news conferences each day. Unfortunately for me, I knew of the coal dust problem. At the time I hoped that the right thing would be done, but I worried that it would be swept aside. My worries were further confirmed when one of my first tasks when I went back to work, I was asked to destroy the remaining splits of the coal dust samples collected on the 6th. I refused and went to the RCMP. I should give the Mounties credit, as they took my concerns seriously and went to the mine later that day with a warrant. Even after all this had happened, in the middle of June 1992, I was laid off permanently. As bad as May and June was, September was in many ways the worst month of 1992 for me. It was in that month I was interviewed by the lead investigator hired by the Department of Labor. After telling him my story, he told me in confidence that even he didn't trust the people he worked for. I realized then and there that the government of Nova Scotia would not likely have my back. Later on, for reasons I still do not know, I wasn't called to speak at the Richards Inquiry. I would have liked to have been able to go on the record at that time. So, for the many years since, I've thought about whether any of this was relevant. I think it was, still is, and lessons can be drawn from what I have to say. And this is the main reason I've decided to come forward. The lesson for me in all this is an increased awareness of safety in the workplace. It is only with the benefit of hindsight that I realize how dysfunctional that workplace was at all levels. Later at the inquiry it became apparent that the dysfunction extended into the government department's tasked to oversee this workplace. I now know that one cannot rely on management in isolation to do the right thing and protect the safety of workers in their charge. Workers, especially those who were young like I was in 1992, need to know they have the absolute right to refuse any work they feel is unsafe without fear of losing their job. Those who have information about unsafe working conditions need to have a place to turn to express their concerns without repercussions. I should say that it is encouraging that government policy and awareness of safety in industry has improved in the years since the explosion. One of the outcomes of the Westray disaster was the passing into law by the federal government of the Westray Bill, which codified the responsibilities of employers. Regrettably, since implementation of this law, it can be said that it has been massively underutilized to hold to account those responsible for workplace safety. In many ways, things have not changed. Jobs are still scarce, and more disturbingly, the rates of workplace deaths and injuries in the last couple of years has been rising in Nova Scotia. We need to refocus our efforts on prevention of workplace injury and deaths. We should redouble our efforts. In my opening remarks, I mentioned I was the son of Jack. I can't forget to mention and thank my mom, Ruth. I'm also now father to 3 sons, Jeff, Scott, and Mark, husband to my wife, Cindy, an uncle, a brother, a co-worker, and a friend, I would hope, to many more. We should honor the memory of the 26 by remembering that the most important thing we can do each day is come home from work. I would also like to see greater use of the Westray bill. Only then will we be able to say that the 26 who died and their families who have suffered since with the loss have done so not in vain. This is my hope. Thank you.